Hello. In this video, I will go over some of the insights that we can draw from the book The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. It's a really fascinating book, and Erin Meyer discusses 8 different dimensions on which cultures vary. Each chapter in her book focuses on one dimension. Now, this being a video where I discuss the entire book in just one video, I of course won't be able to delve really deep into any of the dimensions. My focus in this video is to help you get a bird's eye view of all those 8 dimensions. Of course, I do add certain nuances for each of those dimensions, the Dr. Mishra perspective, you could say. But to understand each of those dimensions in greater detail, you would need to read the book, and you would need to read the book maybe not just once, maybe a few times, to be able to really understand and assimilate the insights, the messages that you get from each of those chapters in the book. In any case, now I will switch my camera to my iPad so that I can help highlight and focus on the points that I want to discuss in this video. So let's start with the story that Erin Meyer starts her book with. It's a really fascinating story. So in this book, you see that Erin Meyer, she is conducting a training session in Paris along with a Paris-based journalist, Bo Chen, who is originally from Wuhan, China, but he's an experienced journalist working in Paris. So this person seems to be a great fit to do a session on cultural intelligence, on how people can understand each other better in the global business environment. So Chen is supposed to provide perspective from the Chinese side because of he being from that region, as well as he being a person who has also been in the West for sufficient amount of time. So he would be a good translator of the nuances in communication. But what happens is pretty interesting. What we see Erin Meyer talking about in these paragraphs, let me just read out. I began this session outlining on a flip chart the cultural issues that people needed to grasp so that time in China would be a success. As the morning wore on, I explained each dimension of the key issues, answered the questions by the participants, and carefully kept an eye on Chen so I could help facilitate his input. But Chen did not seem to have any input. After finishing the first dimension, I paused briefly and looked to him for his input. But he did not speak up. He did not open his mouth, move his body forward, or raise his hand. So what we see here, Chen is expecting her expert to speak up on this matter, but here Chen is not speaking up, which then naturally would unnerve you if you were expecting some inputs from your co-presenter and that person is not giving the kind of inputs that that person is supposed to contribute. In any case, let's keep going further. Apparently, he had no example to provide. Not wanting to embarrass Chen or to create an awkward situation by calling on him when he was not ready, I simply continued with my next point. To my growing dismay, Chen remained silent and nearly motionless as I went through the rest of my presentation. He nodded politely while I was speaking, but that was all. He used no other body language to indicate any reactions, positive or negative. I gave every example I could think of and engaged in dialogue with the clients as best as I could. Dimension after dimension, I spoke, shared, and consulted with the burnouts, who are the main clients here. And dimension after dimension, there was no input from Chen. I continued for full 3 hours. My initial disappointment with Chen was spilling over into full fledged panic. I needed his input for the program to succeed. Although I did not want to create an awkward moment in front of the client, I decided to take a chance. Bo, I asked, did you have any examples you would like to share? And it is only then that Chen sat up in his chair, smiled confidently at the clients, and opened up his book, which was filled with pages and pages of typed notes. Thank you, Erin, he replied. I do. And then, to my utter relief, Chen began to explain one clear, pertinent, fascinating example after another. Anyway, I don't necessarily have to go through the description more, but here Chen is a person who is an excellent communicator. He is not like a shy person or introverted person. He is very comfortable expressing himself. But then he was not speaking up. And that can seem puzzling. So what Erin Meyer is arguing here, that this actually was an issue of culture, not an issue of personality. Because it is not that Chen was not an extroverted person. It's not that this person had any issues with confidence. This person was extremely capable, both content-wise as well as having the right kind of personality traits to speak up. And yet, this person was not speaking up. So, that then makes you wonder, why was this person not speaking up? Anyway, later on, the author reflects on some of the advice that Chen's mother had given him about how you have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth. So how your communication should be in proportion to that, and how this advice had resonated with her. So there are differences in the way people from different cultures behave. Just because somebody does not speak up does not automatically mean that the person is incapable of speaking up. And here especially you see Chen is valuing being a good listener. In fact, what's being said here is that in China we often feel Westerners speak up too much in meetings, that they do this to show off. So while the showing off may seem pretty acceptable norm in the Western culture, it may not be in another culture. I have noticed that Chinese people leave a few more seconds of silence before jumping in than in the West. You Westerners practically speak on top of each other in a meeting. I kept waiting for Erin to be quiet long enough for me to jump in, but my turn never came in. In any case, without again just reading the story entirely, the point is there are different set of expectations that people from different cultures have about communication. There are different set of expectations that people have on themselves while communicating with others. And when there is a difference in the way we see somebody else communicating, sometimes we may attribute it to that person's personality trait that may be accurate in certain situations, but in many other situations, it could be actually a reflection of the personality traits. My pardon, it could actually be a reflection of the person's culture. So it may not be the case that the person is incapable or does not have the right kind of personality traits and skills to communicate in the manner that you would want that person to communicate. Rather, because of the norms, because of the way that the person has been brought up, because of that person's values, that person may communicate in a style dramatically different from that of yours. So if you are aware of these differences, then you will be more successful in navigating through your interactions with people from different cultures. That is the primary lesson that you will get in this book. We will go through each of these 8 dimensions that Erin Meyer discusses in her book. But let's take a look at this really nice graph that we see here that compares these two countries, Israel and Russia, on each of these 8 dimensions. So for some of the dimensions, we see Russia and Israel being fairly similar. So both Russia and Israel tend to be more high context. In terms of scheduling, we see they more on the side of being flexible time. They both are on the confrontational dimension as opposed to avoiding confrontational dimension. But when it comes to some of the other dimensions, we see dramatically different approaches. So we see Israel more on the application, whereas Russia more on the principles. We see Russia being more on the hierarchical side, whereas Israel more on the egalitarian side. So what I want you to do is to do a similar kind of analysis for the countries that you are interested in analyzing. When you are interacting with a person from a culture different from yours, try to compare your country's culture with that country's culture. On what dimensions are these two cultures similar? On what dimensions are these two cultures dramatically different from each other, or maybe moderately different from each other? That then will give you some ideas about how you can be more effective in your interaction with that person. Okay, so now let's discuss the first dimension that Erin Meyer discusses, and that is the dimension of communication. What is the nature of good communication in different countries? We see some countries tend to have what are called high context communications. What do we mean by high context communication? Communication here is more implicit. There are a lot of non-verbal ways through which communication happens. There's a lot of context that you would need to be aware of to be able to understand what's being discussed. So there's a lot that is implied as opposed to everything being explicitly stated. So that's the reason here you see this discussion of there being a lot of nuances. It's layered. You have to read between the lines to understand what exactly is being communicated. And some of the countries that you see here that have high context communication, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, China, Kenya, India, Saudi Arabia, these are countries that have long histories. These are not new countries like US, Australia, Canada, right? So, because of the long shared history, you can expect that they would have developed a way of communicating that people within the culture can easily understand. They have that shared history. Let me give an example to illustrate what I'm trying to say. Imagine you are at home and your dad is speaking to you in a very quiet voice, maybe even very softly, but his tone changes slightly, and that may indicate to you that he is upset. Now, he is not yelling, he is not showing any obvious signs of anger for you to pick up that he is angry, and yet, based on how he is speaking and the slight change in the tone of his voice, even though he continues to speak softly, you have figured out that he's upset about something and you need to approach him differently than you would have had he been in a happy state of mind. Now, if your friend was in the same room, that friend may not catch these nuances. Because why? That person does not have the same background, the same history with your dad. So that person lacks the context. And consequently, that person will miss some of these subtle cues that you got. So that is the reason you are seeing many of these countries, they tend to have similar kind of history, long history, where then it becomes easier for people within that culture to communicate in a very efficient manner. Whereas an outsider, when that person comes into this culture, will not be able to notice these contextual form of communication. Now, if we contrast these high context culture countries with the low context culture countries here, okay, I'm just discussing the extremes so that it becomes easier for us to understand, although as the figure suggests, it's a continuum. So there can be people at opposite ends of the spectrum, but there can also be people in the middle ranges, right, who are neither too high context nor too low context. In any case, in the low context countries, what do you see? You will see more explicit form of communications where messages are very direct and maybe everything is explained in explicit detail. Everything has to be clear, and there will be a stronger reliance on verbal communication, right? Because in verbal communication, you spell out everything, which you may not do in the non-verbal communication. Again, these are things that I have discussed also while I was discussing Hofstede's dimension. So you will see, well, I would let you figure those parallels between Hofstede's dimensions and the high context, low context communication here. But everything has to be more open in the communication style that you will see in the low context communication, as opposed to the high context communication that we just discussed. So, an example, in fact, let me give a different example more from the business context here. In most Western countries, you will see communication tends to be more explicit. Not all Western countries, of course, but in many Western countries like France, it's pretty high context as opposed to US, Australia, Canada. But imagine somebody comes to US for a business meeting And in the business meeting, you will see the boss may lay out the details very clearly. In fact, the boss may even do a PowerPoint presentation where everything is discussed explicitly, maybe even everything, specific instructions, specific directions, so that there is no ambiguity about anything. So that would be a form of communication that you would see in low context cultures. Or the emails, everything may have to be stated explicitly with clear directions, clear indication of what is expected and what needs to be done. That would be low context culture. Whereas all those explicit directions may not necessarily be needed in the high context culture, because it is understood what's happening and what the expectations are. So anyway, that's the difference between the low context versus high context cultures. Now you should be asking yourself, how can you navigate yourself in a high context culture if you come from a low context culture, and vice versa? How can you be more effective in a low context culture if you come from a high context culture? You may think it is going to be easier for the high context culture people in the low context culture than the other way around, and there may be some truth to it, but each time a person comes from one culture to a culture that is dramatically different, you will see a different set of challenges. Now, what would be those challenges? I want you to think about it. I should not be, of course, stating everything explicitly here. So that's something to think about. Okay, so now let's go to the second dimension, which is the evaluating dimension. How do people from different countries provide negative feedback? Some countries, those who are on the direct negative feedback extreme, they tend to be very direct, very blunt, very honest when they are providing any negative feedback. They do not feel the need to sugarcoat anything. They are just very open with the criticism that they are providing. Whereas in these countries that are in the indirect way of providing negative feedback, they feel uncomfortable providing straightforward negative feedback. So they tend to be more diplomatic, or they tend to couch their criticism with some superlatives so that the harmony is still preserved, so that you don't upset others, so that you aren't offending the other person. So these are the kind of differences that we see in the indirect negative feedback and direct negative feedback countries. Now in here you see UK and US, they are pretty close to each other, but they are in the middle range. They are not either strong indirect negative feedback or strong direct negative feedback. But in comparison to Netherlands, for instance, UK is more indirect negative feedback, and this is illustrated really well in some of these examples that are shared here. So a Britisher may be starting a negative feedback. Often you would see this even in the US, with all due respect, and then they say the negative feedback. So this is in a way contradictory, right? You start your statement with such positive term, with all due respect, but essentially anytime you hear that, you know what's coming next. It's coming that, hey, you messed up here, or you said something wrong here. Now the Dutch, or the people from Netherlands, who are more direct in their negative feedback here, right? They may not hear, or they would actually expect some positive comment coming, especially when they are hearing the term due respect. They may get the impression that, oh, this person is listening to me. So these are some interesting ways that cultures vary on how comfortable or uncomfortable they are with respect to providing negative feedback. And again, if you remember the conversations that we have had regarding personality traits, this has a direct parallel with the personality dimension of agreeableness. People who tend to be highly agreeable, they are not very comfortable with conflict. They tend to actually provide more indirect negative feedback. Whereas those who are on the less agreeable side, they tend to be more direct in their negative feedback. But here, of course, we are discussing differences in the cultures of people. So, one thing that you could ask, or at least a question that comes to my mind, the fact that people who are providing indirect negative feedback, they are doing in a subtle way. Isn't this similar to a high context, a culture? Right? For instance, that example of with all due respect, people within that culture, they will immediately understand that that phrase is going to be followed by some negative comment. Whereas somebody who is an outsider may not get that expectation right away. So, can't we say that indirect negative feedback is more high context culture and direct negative feedback is a low context culture? And I think there can be a fair argument that could be made pertaining to that. But there are some differences though. Even though there are certain similarities, and I would argue a little bit more than what Erin Meyer would argue. But Erin Meyer argues that they are independent dimensions. That's the reason you see countries that are high context where implicit communication happens. And in indirect negative feedback, of course, again, implicit communication happens while providing negative feedback. So there are a whole host of countries that are both high context as well as high in providing negative feedback. But then there are also countries that, although fewer, that tend to be low context and yet high on the indirect negative feedback dimension. So they are that way independent dimensions. Although I think there will be some correlations, although again not very high correlations. But this is more of a empirical finding where you see countries can exist in all these four combinations. So which is an illustration that they are different dimensions. But at a more theoretical level, at a more conceptual level, you can think of context referring to explicit versus implicit communication in many areas of life, in all areas of life. Whereas when we are talking about the evaluation dimension, we are only talking about how that implicit versus explicit communication manifests in context of only providing negative feedback. That's the key difference. And understand that sometimes you may be able to provide negative feedback in a very direct way, but still there may be some context. So you may, for instance, express your negative feedback in a direct way, but that could be non-verbal, right? Whereas in this area, you will see direct negative feedback may be provided explicitly through words. So those are some of the ways that you may see differences between these different countries with respect to how they provide negative feedback. But really interesting dimension. And you can imagine why this would be of great importance, because one of the jobs of any leader is to provide criticism, provide feedback on people's performance. Now, how should you provide that feedback? Can you be explicit in can you state explicitly that you did not do things as well, or can you not do that? And depending on which culture you come from and which culture you are operating in, of course, also your own personality traits would influence how you provide that negative feedback. And not just that, the person at the receiving end of the negative feedback will take things differently based on what that person's personality traits are. And because this is a culture class, we should focus, of course, more on the culture dimension. How that person takes your negative feedback will also be determined based on what culture that person comes from. Is it a culture that is used to providing and receiving direct negative feedback, or is it a culture that is not used to it and consequently provides more indirect forms of negative feedback? Next dimension that Erin Meyer talks about is the dimension of persuasion. How do people from different cultures structure their arguments so that they can influence others in a very convincing manner? So we have two major styles here. Countries that tend to focus on the principles, and then there are countries that tend to focus on the applications. If it's an application focused culture or application first culture, what would you say? You would see people making arguments by sharing case studies or real life applications of the ideas, of the main theories. So the real life applications, the benefits that you would get by incorporating that idea, those benefits tend to get emphasized more. How is that idea useful to me? How is that idea something that I could make use of and be more effective in my life? Those are the kind of things that tend to get emphasized more in the application first countries. Whereas in the principles first countries, you will see greater emphasis on the principles, meaning the theories, the concepts. So, what are the foundational principles? That needs to be emphasized more and that needs to be explained more. That's where the emphasis is. And consequently, people from those cultures will tend to pay a lot of focus to that theoretical framework as opposed to discussing the practical applications, which is what you would see in the application first countries. Of course, US is more on the application side and in some ways figure it out from the idea that case studies tend to be one of the popular methods of teaching, where professors tend to use case studies to illustrate, especially in business, to illustrate both the challenges as well as the success stories of business, because then people will be able to relate to those success stories or to those challenges and learn from those challenges. So the focus is more on the practical application, focus is more on real life examples. Whereas in the more principle focused countries, you will see greater emphasis placed on the theoretical framework. In some ways, I am probably somewhere in the middle, but I do give a lot of importance to the principles. In fact, that is something that you may have noticed in my approach to teaching. I give a lot of emphasis to the first principles, what are called the foundational principles. If you are clear about those foundational principles, then everything else becomes easier, right? So this could be also related to cultural differences then. Now, why is this important? Because if you are taking an approach to persuasion different from what is yours, you may not be as successful in your persuasion attempt. For example, if you are a person who is principle first kind of culture, from that's the culture that you are coming from, and somebody gives you a lecture that is more application first oriented because that person comes from that culture, you will probably feel that this presentation was lot of fluff. Yeah, some examples and everything to make things interesting, but you did not really dive into the topic. You did not provide any deep insights about the topic. That's how somebody from the principles first culture may feel about a presentation that's more application focused, and vice versa, in the sense that if you are an application first kind of person and somebody from principles first person comes and gives you a lecture, you may find it boring. You may find that presentation unrelatable because it's not answering the so what question. Okay, I understand the theory, everything, but what is in it for me? I remember sometimes this dialogue now. One of the Tom Cruise movies, Show Me the Money, right? And again, that's I'm forgetting the title of the movie, Jerry Maguire, yeah. Show Me the Money, that's one of those dialogues there. The focus is on the results. So how is it going to benefit me? So if I were, for instance, approaching writing a book, how would I structure my arguments in the book? Should I focus a lot on the theories, make a lot of attempts to explain those theoretical arguments really well, or should I focus more on the practical application of those theories, right? Those are the kind of things that come into play here. Yeah, I think that's enough for this persuasion. Now, Erin Meyer, of course, goes into a lot of detail into each of those dimensions, which I cannot in just one single video. That is the reason you should always read the books and not just rely on the videos. But here's a quick illustration of how the persuasion dimension can be discussed also from the perspective of how people view things. Is it a very holistic kind of view or a more micro view? And each has its own strengths and weaknesses. So a Western participant takes a very close-up view of a photograph, of a portrait photograph, whereas an Asian participant takes a more wide-angle view for the portrait photograph. They both have their own sets of advantages and disadvantages, right? Here you see the facial features, the eyes, the lips, nose, everything, the flaws as well as the strengths of all those features in the close-up. So there's a lot of detail that gets missed here in that distant kind of photograph. But in this picture, you get a lot of contextual details, which is not there in this photograph. Especially, you will appreciate this from the fact that in the COVID or post-COVID world, during a lot of the Zoom calls, people used to dress up well above their chest and maybe dressed very shabbily in their lower garments. Sometimes they may not even be wearing any formal attire, may just be in their half pants or trousers, whereas the upper portion may be very well dignified and formal. So the point is, each of these photographs tend to provide different levels of details, which then influences the way we persuade others, and we tend to focus on different things. Anyway, or I should not go into more details. Let's go to the next dimension. So the next dimension is about leading. And we see some cultures that tend to be very hierarchical, whereas some other cultures that tend to be very egalitarian. I would say this is very similar to the power distance dimension that I have discussed in great length while discussing Hofstede's dimensions. So the hierarchical countries would be the high power distance cultures, whereas the egalitarian would be the low power distance cultures, where equality and shared decision making amongst team members, those things get emphasized a lot. Whereas here, respect for authority, respect for people in authority, and there being clear distinctions in authority getting emphasized a lot. So anyway, I won't repeat that again here because that is something that I have discussed in fair amount of detail in my previous video, although there are a lot of nuances here, which again you will get only when you read the book here. The next dimension is related to how you make your decisions. So this is about what Erin Meyer talks about, the big D versus the little d kind of decisions. So when we are talking about the big D, we are talking about the big, significant decisions that have a lot of important implications in your life, whereas the little d decisions, are the less critical decisions. The level of consensus that you may seek for these two different kinds of decisions would naturally vary. So for the little d kind of decisions, you can make those decisions quickly. You can move forward with them very quickly without having to consider all the different considerations that should go into decision making. Whereas if it's a really important decision that you are taking, you probably want to take inputs from many people. You may want to even build a consensus so that there is greater buy-in, and so that there is also a higher likelihood of you having reached the right decision. So for the dimension of deciding, then again you have the top-down cultures and the consensual cultures. And this may again sounds very similar to the power distance dimension that I have discussed in great detail before, because high power distance then would be top-down culture, and consensual culture would be the low power distance culture, right? And in some ways, yes, but there are certain other nuances that goes beyond high power distance versus low power distance. So in consensual cultures, of course, you are taking feedback from many people. You are trying to reach a consensus. You are taking inputs from many people, from multiple stakeholders to arrive at your decision. Whereas in top-down, as the term suggests, the person in authority position in the hierarchy can take the decision, and people underneath, the subordinates, are then expected to follow those directives. So this may seem like a clear case of high power distance versus low power distance culture. But especially when you go through this detailed description of the Japanese ringi system, you get actually greater insights on the fact that how a system can be very hierarchical, in other words, high power distance, and at the same time ultra consensual, meaning low power distance culture, right? So, and that is something they see in the Japanese ringi system, where there is the hierarchical structure, where lower level managers have higher level managers, and there is a hierarchical process of going through approvals or developing proposals, where then you have to get things approved at the higher level. But in the ringi system, what's happening is that it's a bottom-up approach, where you vet the ideas with everyone at that lower level, and then you take it to the next level. So through this process you are building consensus. It's not a top down decision where the boss takes the decision and everyone else follows. So while there is a hierarchy, there is still a process of getting consensus, getting ideas, feedback from people at the lower levels, and vetting the decisions, making sure that there is greater buy-in from everyone, as well as the assurance that the right decision is being taken. Because again, people at the top will not know the specific challenges or the ways that systems can be improved. In fact, the Kaizen system is, I would say, a great example of the Ringi system, where people at the lowest level of an organization are held responsible as well as given the authority to make decisions to change things in the system that can then improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the system. Anyway, I won't go into all these details, but I just wanted to illustrate the point or emphasize the point that this dimension of deciding consensual versus top down is not automatically the power distance dimension that I have discussed before. There are differences between these dimensions. So the previous dimension that I discussed, leading, egalitarian versus hierarchical, and this dimension, deciding, where there is consensual versus top-down decision making, they seem related, and there are definitely connections, but there are distinctions as well. Now let's go to the next dimension, which is the trusting dimension. And in my titles this chapter, the head versus the heart. So head refers to, of course, the cognitive dimension, the thinking aspect of our life, and heart is the more affective or the emotional aspect of our life. So when it comes to trusting, there are two types of trust. There is cognitive trust, which is more focused on people's accomplishments, skills, competencies. When you see a person who has a lot of accomplishments, when you see a person who is highly skillful or very competent, then you naturally trust that person to get the task done, right? So that is the task-based end of the spectrum. Whereas when we are talking about affective trust, the trust comes from your emotional connection with the person. You may have some history with the person. There may be some love and affection and care, due to which you know that this you can trust this person. Like your mom, you know that she cares for you, so that's the reason you trust her, that she will take decisions that are for your benefit, for instance. But you will not trust your mom to perform a surgery on you unless she herself is a surgeon, right? So that would be task-based trust or the cognitive-based trust. You will trust a surgeon to for that particular task. So these are the different types of trust that we are talking about. Why are we talking about trust in context of cultures? Because cultures vary in terms of how much of importance they give to these different types of trust. So in the task-based cultures, you will see the leaders, the employees, they tend to focus a lot on competency, on getting tasks accomplished. So then they will give more importance to clear objectives, performance metrics, results. And if you are good at those things, then you will be trusted more. Whereas in the relationship based cultures, there is a greater emphasis on what? Personal connections, on loyalty. So You will trust those people who help contribute to a supportive kind of work environment, who give you a sense of community. In fact, when it comes to skills, you may value emotional intelligence more than general intelligence that may be more related to task performance. So, these are the different kinds of trust and how cultures may vary based on where they are on these ends of the spectrum. So let's go to the next dimension. And it's really interesting the way Erin Meyer talks about the needle versus the knife. So, what's the metaphor here? In the needle focused cultures, there is greater emphasis on tact or being subtle and being a little bit diplomatic, versus in a knife culture, you are being confrontational in a very aggressive manner. So, this some cultures tend to be very confrontational, whereas other cultures are avoiding confrontation. So, this may actually remind you of the second dimension that we had discussed, that of how you provide negative feedback. And this may seem very similar to that. And in some ways, yes, I would say, because even here you would see the parallel with the agreeableness dimension of personality traits. But there are, of course, certain differences as well. So, the negative feedback dimension focused more on how feedback is delivered across cultures and how they are perceived by people in different cultures. So, of course, all people value constructive criticism, but that constructive criticism may get manifested differently in different cultures. In some cultures, a particular type of criticism may come across as very destructive if it is very direct, whereas in another culture it may not come across as being destructive. So that was about the feedback aspect. So here we are talking not just about feedback, but discussion on any form of disagreement, any form of debate. How do you come across? And there are actually several things to consider here. Some are confrontational, some are less confrontational, but there is also the aspect of emotional expressiveness. So, confrontational, of course, I have already spoken about in terms of how open you are when it comes to addressing and discussing disagreements or conflicts. So, if you are highly confrontational, you don't care so much about the confrontation being a little bit open and explicit. Whereas in the avoidance of confrontation, you will be a little mindful of how you confront somebody, because you value group harmony and you don't want your relationship to be negatively impacted. But there is also this aspect of emotional expressiveness. Some countries tend to be emotionally expressive, and some countries not so expressive. So these are orthogonal dimensions. Avoid confrontation, but then there is the aspect of emotional expressiveness. So this would be how expressive people are in a particular culture. Some people openly display their emotions, and there are certain cultures where both the positive feelings and the negative feelings tend to get expressed very openly. Cultures like Spain, France, they tend to be expressive, or in India, which is more on the avoidance confrontation side, but very emotionally expressive. But then there are other cultures that are not very expressive. Japan, in fact, long ago, I had seen a video where the Japanese managers were having difficulty smiling, and how they had to be trained to express smiles. So that's the difference between emotionally expressive versus emotionally unexpressive culture. So cultures vary on multiple dimensions, and this is something to keep in mind. Now let's quickly go through the last dimension, and that's about how you perceive time and how you schedule time, right? So if you get late to a meeting, how late would be considered really late? And um, uh, how late would not be considered late? So there are cultures where time is seen as a linear kind of variable, which means that you adhere to schedules, you emphasize punctuality a lot. It's a very structured approach to time. Time is linear means it's finite. You don't have unlimited time. So you value efficiency. You focus on planning things ahead so that you can make use of the time wisely. So if you are looking at the meetings in such cultures, you will see methodical planning for the meetings. There will be a set agenda that will be sent out for meetings. In fact, if it is a super linear time culture, then you may even have specific time allotted for different items in the agenda. So there will be specific start and end time so that you are not exceeding that time set for that particular item. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you have cultures that are flexi time. India, Kenya, many of the cultures, traditional cultures, tend to have a flexible time. In fact, in India, the concept of time is more cyclical. In fact, the law of karma and everything. Again, I don't necessarily want to go into those details, but as opposed to linear, time is considered more cyclical in the Indian way of thinking. But in any case, we won't go into those details here, but let's focus on the flexible time concept. So what does flexible time mean? Means that you can be a little bit relaxed. You are not so focused on being there somewhere before the time that you're supposed to meet. If you are a little late, it's okay. There is a bit of flexibility. It is understood. So if you are supposed to be meeting, especially let's say for informal gatherings, it's okay if you are a few minutes late, maybe even an hour late. But of course, that won't be the case for official meetings. But even there, for official meetings, a little bit late may be considered all right. But in a highly linear country like Germany, that would be considered offensive if you are late even by a few seconds or by a few minutes. And by the way, we see individual differences. Some people tend to be more flexible time, some people tend to be more linear time. I had a professor who would shut the door a minute after the class time, so she won't let anyone in. So that would be a very linear time kind of professor, whereas there were other professors who don't mind letting you in even if you are half an hour late or 45 minutes late into the class, right? So like anything else, we can see personality level differences as well. But there are many advantages of each of these different types of cultures. Of course, you can understand the advantages of linear time, where you are valuing time. But when you are in a flexible time culture, that can also have its own sets of advantages. There can be more spontaneity in your interactions. Everything may not be as structured. You may be even open to more, as well as more adaptable to unexpected events. Because you plan everything here, anything that deviates the plan, that messes you up completely. Whereas because you are used to this flexible kind of approach, you almost follow the MacGyver kind of principle where You things don't work out, you make things work out based on whatever is available with you. In any case, I don't want to be diving deeper and deeper into these topics. The key is to for you to study each of these dimensions in greater detail from the book. But hope this video gave you enough insights about each of these dimensions and help you navigate people from different cultures better. So with that, I will stop my video. Thank you.